your host, Joe Cristiano.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Talk Radio. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Folks, today we are going to have with us Ilya Shapiro. He is the senior fellow with the Cato Institute on Constitutional Studies. We're trying to get him on the line as I speak. We're going to talk about the RFRA, that's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, its implications, where it emanated from, and where we think it's going, what effect it basically has had on our decision-making in government and on our lives itself. I have some very strong opinions on this, so I'm anxious to hear what Ilya has to say. We are trying to get him on. Do we have him on the line right now? We do not have him on the line. All right. Well, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was written to sort of codify that religion should be free from government regulation, in a sense. However, once government writes regulation, then they have to write it in specific language. The attorneys have to look at it, and then when something else pops up, another situation crops up, which is different than the reason why they wrote the first legislation. Now they have to reinterpret what they wrote. And we've been doing this since 1963. In fact, it all started, I believe, and I want to ask our guest this question, but there was a case, Sherbert versus Werner, where the government had to prove compelling state interest when action is placed which substantially, burdens that belief. And once you get into language such as that, it just becomes too malleable and too up to interpretation. My problem with all of this is that it violates basically the very basic tenet of free association. It also violates the concept of separation of church and state. Everyone should be free to associate with whomever they wish. Whether or not you're a business owner, a corporation, it really makes no difference. In fact, the big argument is like back in the Deep South, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, there was segregation. All right, we have him on the air now. All right, Ilya.
Yes.
We have you. We finally have you on the pipe here. There you go. Now, see, I don't like this already. You're better looking than I am. See, this is where we're off to a bad start, I tell you that, And you're younger, So, by the way, just for your information, today is my 72nd birthday.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? I didn't think I'd make it to 60.
To give you, presents and things.
I'm only mentioning that because I can't believe I'm this old. I keep on touching myself to see if I'm still alive, Well, thank you so much for being on the program. I've already introduced you as being the senior fellow in constitutional studies with the Cato Institute. And in the interest of full disclosure, I am I have been a financial supporter of the Cato Institute for many, many years, together with those organizations that are closely aligned with you guys, which is the Future of Freedom Foundation, Jacob Hornberger, the Foundation of Freedom, Foundation for Economic Education, and the Reason Foundation, as well as others. That's why I drive a 1996 Subaru, because all my money goes to foundations. You understand that. Well, you have also you've been interviewed many times on television, and you are a survivor of the Colbert Report, I understand.
That was the pinnacle of my career. That's 5 years ago. I'm going to have to figure out what the next big thing will be.
Wow, that's great. By the way, I did see that. I thought that was kind of interesting. You did very, very well. I don't know if I would have survived him. But today we're going to talk about the RFRA, or the Freedom Freedom Restoration of
Religious Freedom
Restoration. I know I was going to get that wrong. I know it like the back of my hand, but I figure I get it wrong when I put it on the air. Now, could we try to start from the very beginning? I have all sorts of problems with this act, although the intentions in some respects were honorable, and you think they would be fostering freedom. They get tied up in legal language. Did all of this start back in 1963 with the Werner versus Sherbert Act, where the government had to prove a compelling interest, whether or not a belief, a certain act put burdens on certain people's belief? Can you sort of bring us from the beginning forward so we know where we're starting?
Yeah, 1963 is a good place to start in this context. Until that time, the Supreme Court said that if some act by the government or some law, as long as it was targeting religious practice specifically, if it was burdening or infringing on religious exercise, tough, go to the legislature for your fix. In 1963, this case of Sherbert versus Werner reversed that. It said that government has to go out of its way, even in generally applicable laws, not to burden religion. And indeed, if it was, you could get an exemption. That was a short-lived interregnum or exception to the long-standing rule, because in 1990, 27 years later, in a 6-3 ruling, in an opinion by Justice Scalia, it's kind of funny how these things play out, because this case that I'm about to talk about, Employment Division versus Smith, is seen as an anti-religion ruling, right. And yet it was written by Justice Scalia, joined by the conservatives, with dissents by Justice Marshall and a couple of liberals. So anyway, in that case, some Native Americans were using peyote, a hallucinogenic drug, in their rituals, and they were fired from their job and then denied unemployment benefits. And they went to court and said, hey, this isn't drug use, this is part of my religious exercise. And under Sherbert versus Werner, the government's burdening my exercise. And the court essentially reversed Sherbert, as I said in this opinion by Scalia, and said again, as long as the government action or law isn't specifically targeting or specifically discriminating against religion, it's okay. And if you don't like that, go get a fix from Congress, from the state legislature. In response to that, that was not popular anywhere, basically. The left, the right, the mainstream, everyone was up in arms about this. And the House unanimously passed. In the Senate, it was 97-3. The Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and then it was signed by President Clinton in 1993. I mean, this was, again, not some right-wing plot. Chuck Schumer was one of the lead sponsors in the House, Ted Kennedy in the Senate. I mean, everybody was holding hands, the religious right, the ACLU, minority religions, the Indians. I mean, everybody said, we need to change this. And what this federal RFRA said was that if the federal law or government action burdened religion, then the government could pursue it only if it could show that it had a compelling interest and it was achieving that interest right. in the most narrowly tailored manner possible. That is, there's no other way of achieving that compelling interest. And there actually haven't been that many cases under the federal RFRA until we got to Hobby Lobby last year. I mean, a lot of the cases were kind of really pretextual. That is, people would get arrested for marijuana offenses and say, well, I'm part of the Church of Marijuana, so I shouldn't be subject to this. And they would lose, because the only thing that the court would examine was whether you actually had a sincere belief or whether you were just making it up.
Right. But how does the court prove that? I mean, how does the court codify that or document that, or how do they make that objective?
They take a look at it. I mean, there's an evidentiary hearing in the district court. They don't start looking at it at the Supreme Court. You take it to trial. You present evidence. I've been part of the Church of Marijuana since I was 3 years old. Blah blah. They look at whether this is whether it's even a real religion, or you're just kind of it's the same thing that the tax authorities do when people try to claim tax exemptions and things like this. They don't look too hard. They're not going to judge, oh, well, that what you're claiming, that's not a central part of Catholicism. They're not going to go into a theological inquiry.
Right.
They're just going to look at whether you're making it up or trying to be fraudulent.
I see. Okay.
And there was a case in the 90s that said that federal RFRA could not be applied to the states. And so about half the states either legislatively or through how their state judiciaries have interpreted their state constitutions, effectively have state RFRAs as well.
Right.
As I said, the highest profile case that came under this was Hobby Lobby last year, which was a case where the Department of Health and Human Services interpreted Obamacare to all employers to cover a certain list of contraceptives, and certain religious employers or certain employers that had a religious motivation said that a few of the items on this list were abortifacient, either morning after pill or IUD. They said this is against our religion, and ultimately at the end of the day the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that because the government had other ways of providing free or cheap contraceptives to the employees, they could set up clinics, they could give tax credits, etc. Because there were other ways of doing it, they couldn't force the religious employer to violate their beliefs by paying for these devices and pills, and that was hugely controversial. But again, that was a different issue than with the gay marriage stuff that has lately flared up in Indiana and Arkansas and other places.
Well, doesn't this come into conflict with the right of free association, the separation of church and state? There just seems to be so many parts of, if I want to call natural law, that this legislation sort of violates. Why, if regardless of what state you're in, what difference would it make if I'm an employer and I don't want to do business with you because you're a Protestant? I mean, why should that be anyone's concern? Because if, in fact, there's an employee who is very capable, if I don't hire that person for the benefit of my company, which benefits then the consumer, someone else will hire that person and I will be out of business. Why doesn't the free market really regulate this automatically? Doesn't it regulate it automatically? And once we get into these laws, then you get into legalized wording, and every time an instance comes up, they reinterpret it, and then everyone else has to change the law, whether it be on a state or the federal level. Or am I just too Pollyanna on this subject?
Well, no, you're right. The basic principle of freedom of association says that private individuals, employers, nonprofits, whatever, private entities should be able to associate or not associate, do business or not do business with anyone for good reason, bad reason, or no reason at all. And that's quite apart from religious reasons or what have you. As you were saying before I came on, one of the results of the civil rights era and the response to Jim Crow were anti-discrimination laws.
Right.
And so employers, public accommodations, meaning restaurants and hotels, among other types of businesses, could not discriminate. Foremost, that was put in based on race, but then other protected categories, the usual one, gender, religion, national origin. Some states have sexual orientation. Federal laws do not. Some states do. Some states have political belief. In D.C., for example, you can't discriminate against someone on political belief. I'm not sure how that worked with think tanks. All the think tanks in D.C., some are conservative, some are liberal, libertarian. Is Cato supposed to hire a socialist? I don't know, but if you read the text of the law, maybe. But anyway, because of this really weird and evil, unfortunate situation in the Deep South with Jim Crow, which, by the way, was state enforced. It's not just like all businesses wanted to discriminate, but because there was state enforced segregation, there was justification to put in these laws to say that you can't discriminate. And that's why now, when we're talking, you have the clash of the anti-discrimination laws and religious belief.
Well, that's normally brought up is the Deep South, back in the early part of the 19th century, where we had these laws of separation, but that was from the state level. If the state was neutral, if the state made everything available equally to everyone, eventually that would infiltrate. Because, let's face it, if you're in business and you want to sell a product and there is a person of color and they want to buy that product, if you don't sell it to him, the guy across the street's going to do so. However, if it's state law and you're afraid that you're going to violate state law and then maybe even get beat up afterwards, I can understand that. It's not right, but I can understand why you would be reluctant. But in a true free open society, that would only occur for a short period of time, because eventually the natural competitive nature of man comes in and says, hey, if you want to stay in business, you have a large population that you're ignoring. Heck, I would sell all to people of color. I mean, would that not have occurred?
No, that's in today's society, I think you can safely repeal federal and state anti-discrimination laws. I mean, in Indiana, say, or Arizona, these places where these state RFRAs has flared up the last little while, I think businesses that advertise we're gay friendly would get more business that say we don't serve gays, or we don't work gay marriages. At least that's the way that pressures work. And there's the social, non-governmental coercion. That's the way that the market is supposed to operate. A, that you're not hiring the best workers for reasons that have nothing to do with productivity, and B, social forces, excuse me, social forces will act to condition people, and there's no need to punish the mountain man in Idaho who's isolated and wants to practice some weird religion or has some weird beliefs. There's no reason why he shouldn't be able to have his freedom, and then at the same time you have a multiplicity of businesses in major metropolitan areas.
Yeah, but we're talking about religion, but if you talk religion, you have to talk about every other prejudice. You can't isolate religion and say, well, we allow everybody of every religion. However, if you have blonde hair, forget it. You're never going to be, it cuts across all lines. And let me give you a real live personal example. I have an occupational health testing company where we have technicians going out to companies, giving physicals and hearing testing and all fitting respirators and training and stuff like that. Right now, quite frankly, I have one tenant that I said, we don't hire anyone with tattoos. And I'll be now I have friends who have tattoos. I'm not angry with them. I'm good friends with them. They're wonderful people, but I will not. That is a prejudice, because the perception that someone with a tattoo has, it to me has a negative connotation. I don't want that negative connotation. Now, you can say that you are exerting a prejudice, thus it should be illegal. I mean, you can go that far. You can go that far with anything. A person can come in and I can say, well, when I interview someone, aren't I consumed with all sorts of prejudices? If I think a person that has long hair, for example, person be very qualified, don't like people with long hair, I don't hire them. That's a prejudice. Shouldn't the government be forcing me to hire that person because the government feels it's the most qualified person?
Right. That's you want to the argument is that we should keep extending these regulations of employers or of businesses to say that you just can't make those sorts of so-called irrational decisions. And I actually share your prejudice against tattoos. And I give that example a lot because people are losing sight of the idea that we can not like something or think it's bad for you, it's bad for society, and yet not criminalize it or regulate it in some way. Tattoos are a good example. Men with long hair, perhaps. Different types of music. Right. Let's say I don't like heavy metal. Someone else doesn't like country. Different strokes for different folks. There's nothing for the government to get involved there.
Right. Yeah. And again, I have very, very dear friends that have tattoos. They're sharp guys. They got them when they're young, and I never asked them whether or not they ever regretted getting them. But it's one of those things where I think it's kind of silly because it's permanent. Now, if I had to go into business, I would go in a temporary tattoo business where you can wash it off. I think I'd make $1 million bucks. But because people can do it as a lark. I get tattooed when I go to a ball game. They have. For donation to a particular charity, they'll paint your face with watercolor and stuff like that. Oh, I get all painted up and stuff like that. I go home and I wash it off. I mean, it's fun.
Here's the other distinction that can be drawn between employment discrimination laws and public accommodation laws. So let's say that anti-discrimination laws are valid. We'll cabin this libertarian discussion about freedom of association will say, okay, because of our nation's history, we want a better society. It's justified. However, whatever constitutional argument you want to make, that you can't discriminate when you're hiring or promoting employment decisions based on race and gender. Fine. That's different than saying I don't want to work this type of ceremony because of my religion, be it you're Jewish and it's a Ku Klux Klan rally,
right.
Be it you're religious in some way, you don't want to work some devil worshiping thing, or be it a gay marriage, whatever you might have an objection to. I serve anarchists and devil worshippers, but I don't want to work their ceremony or something like that.
Right.
There are differences that could be drawn in that sense, and there's a further difference potentially with the First Amendment with freedom of speech. So we had the case with a New Mexico wedding photographer. Maybe there's something creative or expressive about baking. Maybe there's a difference there between that and a limo company or a caterer or something like that. A difference between a priest, an officiant who actually participates in a ceremony, and a valet who just parks the cars when you're getting there. So there could be other types of more narrowly sliced legal views on how
right.
these cases are treated.
Yeah, well, you have religion in and of itself. The precepts of religion is a very narrow belief system, so it prejudices against all other religions. So you can say, by virtue of its existence, religions are exercising a prejudice and segregation. You can draw this out, and what bothers me is that when we take a concept and we start applying it, but this knife has to cut both ways. What if a person is walking down the street and wants to buy something and sees a store that sells it and realizes that person is someone they don't like because they're gay, they're Jewish, they're Catholic, whatever the prejudice is, right? And they decide, I'm not going to buy there because this person's a Catholic, and go someplace else. Isn't that person in violation of the law?
Yeah. It certainly, those federal and state anti-discrimination laws prohibit you from not hiring someone because you're. In terms of a shopper, you mean not going into the store, boycotting the store for that reason.
It's got to cut both ways.
And there are no laws against that, actually.
But wait a minute, you can't have a law. If you do it, it's bad. If I do it, it's okay. It can't cut that way.
Yeah, that's one of the kind of incongruities once you go down the road of regulating what good reasons are and good reasons aren't for doing business with someone.
Yeah. Now, and I think this is a problem that we have with most federal regulation, is that it attacks a very, very narrow precept, and yet once you get out of it, you find all the inconsistencies. Then you need more legislation. I guess I'm at my age, by the way, and I'm allowed to do this. Now that I'm 72, I can do anything I want, by the way. Do you know that? I'm not constrained at all. In fact, that can't even put me in jail. I'm too old. But
I'm looking forward to that. 4 years from now.
Well, you're looking for me going to jail, right?
No. I'm looking forward to not having constraints. Not.
Well, no, you really you care less, and
right.
you realize how unfair life is, and you realize that some of the things you did when you were young, and the prejudice that you held. I had when I'm a street kid from East Harlem. I'm an East Side boy from East Harlem. I sang doo-wop back in the 50s. And I recall my father having a birthday, and I decided to surprise him. My doo-wop singing group sang songs to him, in his apartment, and on First Avenue and 123rd Street. And afterwards, I got thrown out of the house because my lead was a black guy and my second tenor was a Puerto Rican. We've come a long way since then, right? We've come a long way since then. But yet, so I want you to know where I'm coming from is that I've never been in this, there's a black neighborhood, there's a white neighborhood. I hate that stuff. I think we are all equal. Everyone is equal. In fact, in most cases, people that we think less of are more equal than we are. But we don't want to admit that.
Your next show, you should get your group back together again. Get those guys back in your studio.
I tell you, I'd love to. Freddie sang 100 Pounds of Clay better than the original artist in the Skylines. He was fantastic. Anyway, but I really would love to see those guys again. I haven't seen them in over 50 years, but, and we had a great time. But how do we take a country which seems to be entangled in so much verbiage litigation that it seems that we're fractured in no matter what you bring up, you'll find 3 and 4 fractions. We're not getting better. We're not becoming a nation of free people. We're becoming a nation of legislation. And when you're a nation of legislation, you find that no two people could ever agree on anything. How do we get away from this? How do we break away? How do we say, hey, guy, you're free to do whatever you want, provided you do not infringe upon the equal rights of others? Go, girl, go type thing. How do we get there?
It's especially that look at the cases with this extreme aggressive political where students need trigger warning is going to be exposed to thoughts that will challenge their thinking and things like this. Really weird stuff going on college campuses now. I mean, at the end of the day, what I try to hammer home is the difference between the government acting and everyone else, because the government really does need to treat everyone equally. We pay our taxes. We are all equal citizens. It's responsible to us, whatever you're talking about, the city government or the state or the federal, and it cannot take into account race or gender or anything other than what's actually relevant to what it's doing. But private individuals, and you can't beat somebody up, you can't extort them, all that sort of thing. But you can't, at the end of the day, punish people either with civil fines or let alone criminal punishments for what's in their head. And we try to regulate these things, and ultimately what employment law, because of this plethora of legislation and litigation, whether it's employment lawyers or business lawyers in various kinds, that's why we have these kind of bland corporate environments, and that's why the council is always never say anything that other than pure pablum.
Yeah,
it really makes society less rich.
Right. We're going to take a very quick break, Ilya. And then when we come back, I have a question for you, and we'll start the second part of the program, okay? If you just hold on, don't go away, okay? We'll be right back. Thank you.
Listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Political talk derived from a historical perspective. Not always palatable, but good food for thought. Pure libertarian talk with host Joe Cristiano. LibertyTalkRadio.com.
Express Test is your go-to company for on-site occupational health testing services. That's right, we said on-site. That means we will meet you at your facility for a free health and occupational safety consultation. Express Test specializes in hearing conservation, respiratory protection, and employee safety. We can help you establish viable programs tailored to your business and employee needs. For your free consultation, call 918-743-2929 or visit us at expresstest.com. That's 918-743-2929 or expresstest.com. Do you find yourself asking, what did you say? Aaron Cristiano of Ranch Acres Audiology has over 25 years of experience helping patients just like you.
Hearing requires conservation. We need to be aware and we need to be responsible for our own hearing health.
Understand more with a little help from Ranch Acres Audiology. Call 918-749-7711. That's 918-749-7711 to learn more. We'd like to thank attorney Constance Squires for her support of Liberty Talk Radio. If you want a comprehensive way to affordably avoid legal issues, call Constance Squires. For a free consultation, call 918-254-9283 or go online at isthyWillDone.com.
This isn't your typical talk radio show. This is Liberty. Liberty Talk Radio.
Okay, we're back. Folks, this is Little Bit Talk Radio. My name is Joe Cristiano. And with us today, we have a guest. We're pleased to have Ilya Shapiro, the senior fellow on constitutional studies with the Cato Institute. And there he is. He's back again. I'm sorry, we had a little problem with our board this morning. And are we fixed up with the line? We had a little bit of a glitch, in the speaking. All right, our line is clean. Okay, I have to ask you.
You need me to put on a headphone, the microphone, or whatever? Am I not clear?
Would that be better if we had microphone?
It's the connection.
No, it's okay. It's just the line connection, and sometimes they get. Yeah, the phone line connection. I have to ask you one question. This is off the board. How the only other Ilya that I know of is, you know who that is, Koryakin, from The Man from Uncle. How often do you hear that, if any? I'm just curious.
A lot from people your age.
I hate you. I want you to know that.
Well, what's funny is that I often get confused with there's a law professor at George Mason University named Ilya Soman, who's also an adjunct at Cato. We agree on almost everything. We're even both Red Sox fans, of all things. Yeah. And he's more of a, he's an academic type. I'm more in the media and think tank world. We dovetail, our views dovetail, but it makes us both look twice as productive because people see us and they think that one is the other.
That's great. Well, I had to ask that question because you're the second person that I've known with that name, because it's a very uncommon name, but very popular. It used to be a very popular name about 50 years ago,
It's a very common Russian name. I was born in Moscow. So.
Yeah, very good. Okay. Well, when I say this cuts both ways, has anyone ever brought the government to court and say, fine, this person purportedly, according to your logic, is prejudiced against this group, but this group will not frequent that store. Should not the government now dictate that this group shop at that store? I mean, have they ever tested it on that vein, saying, hey, equal on both sides?
I don't know of a case where the government has forced people to shop, go against, declare that a boycott is illegal. I've seen that.
Oh, we have a. Hold on a second. We have a. Where's that line? What's the matter with the line?
It's just Skype.
Yeah, we have a problem with the phone line. It's not on our end. It's somewhere in Neverland. Okay. Well, let me give you an example. When I was young, I worked in a glove factory, and the glove factory was closely aligned with what they used to call as the Jewish garment district. Now, I have a lot of Jewish friends. In fact, I belong to a Jewish fraternity, so don't go anywhere with this. But what I learned working within the Jewish garment district, and I was one of the very, very few non-Jewish people, is that they did primarily work with people of their religion. I mean, they were a very, very close-knit group. In fact, in many cases, from my recollection, is that you got the blessing of your rabbi before you did business with someone. And talking about being a group of prejudicing everybody else, there was a classic case. But yet, no, and don't get me wrong, I'm not chastising them. I'm just saying, but the government never came down on them.
Right.
It just seems to be such an unequal, unfair, discriminatory action in and of itself. Am I thinking wrong? Please square me away before I go.
Well, it's not common in the way that immigrant communities or ethnic enclaves, you do business with people who whose culture you understand. You think there's less of a chance of getting double-crossed or whatever your reasons are. And you're right. If we had some of the laws, some of the business regulations now, we had them 80 years ago, it's been a weird world. I mean, you would have had police, busting up the Lower East Side, and you're right. It would, it's hard to kind of see how the incongruities and the inconsistencies, as you put it, how those would play out in different eras.
Yeah. In your opinion, does not government regulation actually perpetuate the separation of people by virtue of its laws, where people say, well, I can do this because the law says it's okay, I can't because I can't do this, rather than having, like, I hate to use the word natural law come in, and eventually people assimilate, slowly but surely assimilate, and the prejudices dissipate. Just like I was brought up on in East Harlem, and they were very, very close in enclaves of, the Italian, the Irish, and whatever. But yet within 20 years, all that was gone. I mean, but there was no regulation. It was just a natural tendency to people to migrate and to associate freely.
Well, I mean, just the key takeaway is that freedom of association should reign, except when there's some very compelling reason to go away from that basic rule. For example, if it's the government that's getting involved, as I said, during Jim Crow, and forcing businesses to act. And, there were a lot of businesses at the time that wanted to serve blacks, but they didn't want to fall afoul of the law. And also the KKK would come in and bust them up, and the KKK were also the police. It was the same people.
Right.
And also, if you have a question of monopoly power. So, for example, if it's a small town somewhere in rural Georgia and there's one restaurant that doesn't serve black people, well, then that's a major position. It's not so. It could be that through the operation of antitrust competitive laws, that might be an exception to the general rule, whereas in a major metropolitan area, fine, you have two stores that want to behave that way. I don't think they're going to be in business that long, but, have at it. You'll just go across to your competitor.
Yeah. If I opened up a retail store and say, don't want to do business with Italians, don't like them. I know, because I am one, I don't like them. I don't even like myself. No Italians allowed in the store. I'd be cutting my own throat. I mean, my competitors would be ecstatic if I did that. So why do I need the government? The marketplace will dictate it.
Yeah. I think that's right. And moreover, when this is coming up in the gay marriage context now, I'm in favor of gay marriage. I filed briefs about the case that's going to be argued next week, because again, there's the government that's giving out marriage licenses. The government shouldn't be involved in marriage in the first place, but that's a separate issue. Why would you even want someone who disagrees or doesn't like the fact that you're having this ceremony? Why would you want to have them work it in the first place?
Yeah, well, and people don't have to be married. They can live together. They can have a life together. They can both be gay. No problem. No one knows it. But as soon as you go to the government for a contract to marriage, then all hell breaks loose, and then you have all this litigation.
Well, no, there's a difference between the government action and individuals or businesses. I think that the principle of equality under law and equal protection, that the has to have a very good reason for treating people differently. And tradition isn't good enough. And if you want to talk about kids, then that's an argument about adoption or using reproductive technologies, not about marriage. I mean, there's all these things. So there's a difference in how you treat a government licensing regime versus how you treat regulation of businesses and private individuals.
All right. I guess I don't see the distinction. Could you help me with that?
We're talking about civil marriage.
Yes.
Not talking about religious marriage or things like that. If you're talking about civil marriage and doling out marital licenses, the government has to have a reason for treating same-sex couples differently than opposite-sex couples.
Yeah. Well, but again, should the city or the state or the federal government be involved in the marriage license business?
No, that's what I'm saying. My ideal situation would be for government not to be involved and not make decisions in the first place. And actually, here's the thing. Marriage itself is an ancient institution, but government licensing of marriage is fairly novel. We're talking about 150 years. And it started coming about because states wanted to restrict who could get married. First cousins or not, brothers, sisters,
Right.
Racial. I mean, they wanted to say, okay, it's not proper in these certain circumstances. The purpose originally wasn't to restrict it to same-sex couples or not, but that was the purpose of licensing. And really, at this point, I think that sort of regime has broken down, and you should just, these sorts of relationships should be handled under contract and common law background presumptions rather than having the government bless your union or not.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because they say, well, there's intermarriage, then there's problems in the reproduction arena, in that children may be born, have a higher risk of being born retarded or with some undesirable characteristics. But what if a brother and a sister want to get married and adopt kids? They don't want to have their own kids.
Well, moreover, a brother and sister you could have kids. There's no license that you need to get to the government to have kids or to have sex. So, the marriage certificate isn't going to, if a brother and sister want to have kids, they can have kids. It's only if they want to get married that the state starts getting involved.
Right.
And so,
right.
You have to make this argument that people will have more kids if they get married. I don't know if that correlation is there. Unfortunately, there are more kids being born out of wedlock increasingly. So
yes,
perhaps encouraging marriage would actually decrease. I don't know. That's kind of an issue for sociology. But regardless, it's not that the government is criminalizing getting pregnant if you're siblings. It's instead that it's regulating the giving of marriage licenses.
So, right. Well, then it brings it to question why have a marriage license in the first place. Okay, we'll go down that road. Okay, right now this Religious Restoration Act and any act like that, don't they? If you want to take a look at what you can and cannot do and whatever. Isn't it a condemnation, actually, of the war on drugs, the war on terror, all these wars that we have that restrict us from doing things that affect us personally, but don't affect anyone else? Don't they all interact? If I wanted to. If gays want to get married, let them. I mean, it seemed like we have all of these restrictions on human behavior, where the government feels that it's inappropriate or wrong. Thus, we have all these laws, all wars against them, and then we have the Religious Restoration Act, and there really is no way out of this thing because there are just too many aspects to consider and too many laws that you can possibly violate by taking any action.
Well, I'm not sure whether the two phenomena are connected. I mean, I'm against whenever the government declares war on something, unless it's another country or an army or Al-Qaeda or something, that's an actual war. But whenever it declares a metaphorical war,
right.
That's not good. Whether it be a war on poverty or drugs or terror generally, that means our liberties are going to be restricted in some way, whether it's property rights or speech or behavior, whatnot. These metaphorical wars are not a good thing, and they are part and parcel. Here, I guess, is where the connection is. The more that regulations and mandates and government, the more civil society is crowded out, and ultimately our liberty is reduced. And what's ultimately squeezed out is the public non-governmental space. That is, we have the intimacies of our home, what we can do there, and we have what the government does in terms of the public sector, but there used to be a very broad conception of the public non-governmental space. Your church, your fraternal organization, your business, your Boy Scouts, school, I mean, all these different things. That was civil society. It wasn't private in the sense of intimate your home, but it certainly wasn't the government. And
Correct.
As we have more of life regulated, that space is crowded out and government controlled, and that foments social clashes. Think about the clashes of values that we have, whether you're talking gay marriage, whether you're talking evolution. We wouldn't have these clashes over evolution if there were more school choice and more freedom in how you educated your kids. And for that matter, more local control rather than the federal education department, which is unconstitutional, coming in and dictating, how schools are supposed to be run. So the more that government, and especially the federal government, regulates and mandates, forgetting taxing and spending, I'm not making a general point about big government, but I'm saying more about regulations, trying to control how people behave and what they can do. That's what really creates a lot of these clashes.
There seems to be an assumption that if government is not regulating, government is not doing a job. If they're not voting on a bill, they're not doing their job. To me, it's the exact opposite. When government's supposed to be doing one thing, ensuring that our freedom is not infringed upon. But every time they legislate, they infringe upon our freedom. And people say, that was a do-nothing Congress. There was very, very little legislation. And I say, thank heavens there was no legislation. It probably saved us for a while. It gave us a little bit more breathing room.
Legislative or congressional gridlock is a feature of the system, not a bug.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, and it seems like this is such a bad thing, and I hear this from both sides of the aisle.
Well, the other thing is that people assume that if the government isn't regulating or legislating about some activity or behavior, then they approve it. I talk to people a lot, whatever side they're on, if they're liberal, conservative, and they're railing about this thing, that should be criminalized or punished or regulated. And I say, well, give me an example of something, you don't like, whether it's tattoos, whether it's a type of music, whether it's T-shirts with logos on them. I mean, whatever it is, should we be criminalizing all of that? Whatever we can get a majority to decide they don't like, that should be regulated away or punished. It's no way to live.
Yeah, where do you think, going back to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, where do you think, not all the states have invoked their own, right? There's only a couple of dozen states that have their own Religious Freedom Act?
I think 12 or 13 that have legislated them, but the state court systems and another, it turns out to be just over half of the states effectively have state RFRAs.
All right, those that don't, what is the difference? Where's the dichotomy there? Why, if you have a state that has their own versus others, and what kind of divergence is there within the states of having their own? Are they all really different? Do they all take a different angle?
There are very few commonalities. There are blue states, red states without them. It's not that, the states where there's a greater religious adherence that tend to have them. It's not. It's just they're kind of historical quirks. It's funny, when the Indiana kerfuffle was happening, Connecticut's governor prohibited state travel to Indiana. And Connecticut actually has one of the strictest RFRAs of anyone in the country. Right. Because again, it came out of that era where the Native Americans were prevented from smoking their peyote, whatever. There's very little case law on this, frankly. Again, it's mostly, it's not mainstream religions trying to impose their values on their employees or discriminate against someone. It's mostly kind of quirky, this Church of Marijuana thing, or Native American religions, or things that are not Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, whatever. They're not these large religions that are invoking these. Occasionally or increasingly some Muslim things. But again, the purpose of RFRA isn't to divide us or impose anybody's views. They're saying, look, there's this government law that in some anticipated way is really preventing me from doing something, from practicing my religion. And practicing my religion isn't hurting anyone. It's just letting me, go about this weird thing that I do. And we're for religious freedom, and that's it. Yeah. And at the end of the day, with these anti-discrimination laws, they get past RFRA because every court is going to rule that preventing discrimination based on race is a compelling interest. and there's no other way to achieve that other than to prevent you from hiring someone based on their race.
Right.
Again, cabining that libertarian freedom of association concern, once you're okay constitutionally with anti-discrimination laws, that's a compelling interest. And so there's no way that a state rift, Indiana's, Mississippi's, whoever, is going to be interpreted to say that an employer cannot hire someone based on sexual orientation. If, again, that's part of their laws. Again, not in all states is that part of their anti-discrimination laws.
Yeah. Well, every time there's legislation, it really divides people. Instead of bringing the people together, which is the original intent, typically of of legislation, and then you have people on. In fact, that divides people in more than one. It bifurcates people, it trifurcates people, and et cetera, because everyone interprets it differently. Everyone has a different slant on it, and then you have fractions, and they all argue the tenets of that particular piece of legislation. So you don't have a society where people are allowed to think the way they want to think, do what they want to do, and eventually naturally assimilate. They stay divided because the legislation that never goes away.
That's right. No, that's right. I think there are some states that devote part of their legislative sessions to repealing laws, and they specifically, legislators go out of their way to look at old, backward, outdated laws, and they start repealing them. I think that's a healthy development that Congress should attach. Let's say 1 month a year you can't pass anything new unless it's some emergency or something. But you're looking at laws that are outdated that need to be repealed. I think that would be very healthy. Or in general, laws should have sunset clauses. And it's kind of standard par for the course. You need to renew 5 years.
Yeah.
I think that would be healthy.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to change the subject just slightly, just go off on a different tangent. Right now, in your studies, what are the hot buttons other than RFRA?
Voting rights, campaign finance, immigration, Obamacare. We're going to have this ruling on Obamacare again at the end of June.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens, what kind of reforms are put in if the Supreme Court rules one way or another. One of the pleasures and really interesting things about my job, I've been at Cato 7.5, almost 8 years, and when I started, I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and over the years, I've had to get up to speed and learn about, at a constitutional level, gun rights, immigration, healthcare, education, voting laws, campaign finance, free speech, religious issues, marriage laws now. So, I may be biased because I've only been dealing with this in the last decade professionally, but more and more constitutional issues seem to be relevant and people are talking about them. That, again, I think is a healthy development, whichever side of any particular debate you might be on.
Yeah. Well, I was in Austin last week. My wife and I drove from Tulsa to Austin. We saw Ron Paul, Jacob Hornberger, I guess you know those fellows, and Glenn Greenwald, and Bradley Rahal. And they gave an excellent conference. We drove for 9 hours just for the 3 or 4 hours, but it was well worth the ride. And they all agree that there's an underlying current of libertarianism. They don't call it that. I mean, people don't call it that, but there's an underlying current of individual liberty. People are starting to really feel the pinch of all these government regulations, and they're getting to realize, the younger people that is, are getting to realize that, this system just doesn't work right. We don't like it. There's something about being individual responsibility and freedom. Do you sense that as well?
Yeah, my colleagues, David Bowes and David Kirby, have done a series of studies every few years, and Emily Eakins as well, on public opinion and the libertarian vote. You're right, the word is unwieldy and not that many people know it, but if you drill down, something like 15 or 20% of the population and growing can very fairly be described as libertarians, meaning they think there's too much government regulation in all spheres of life. And I think you're seeing that infiltrate certainly the Republican Party, less the Democrats. They're dealing with kind of a different sort of civil war between the far left progressives and kind of the traditional New Deal or 60s liberals. But certainly in the Republican Party and in the growth of independents, most people who call themselves independent now really are libertarian, and they're dissatisfied with what both parties are presenting in terms of regulation. You see that, Ron Paul had his own challenges in terms of running a national campaign, but Rand Paul, in calling himself a constitutional conservative and developing these sort of theories, as well as, a lot of the Tea Party affiliated politicians, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, everyone has to really start talking that talk, regardless of, what their underlying beliefs might be. But that sort of the libertarian rhetoric is more and more part of our political discourse.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I misspoke. I said Ray Hall. I meant Balco. Balco was there at the meeting with Greenwald. And when I was with 1170 KFAQ, a neocon station, by the way, here in Tulsa, a very big 50,000 watt station, they were stuck ideologically in this, neocon mentality, which of course I was the anomaly, and yet they admitted they would receive more calls on my station, about my station, than any other one. And people would call in really enthusiastic, saying, "We're glad you have someone like that on the air. We're glad we can hear this, because they hear the same, neocon ideology." And they've been doing that for 30 and 40 years. You get tired of that. You listen to it every day. It's just like listening to the same song constantly. And then I came on the scene and I said, well, let's rethink all of this. And it was amazing, the response that I received. But yet they couldn't change. They wouldn't give it all. They had to stay with their ideology, and I thought that was kind of interesting. So that's why I left and I have my own studio. That's what I have now. Anyway, we are almost at the hour. I'd like to give you the next couple of minutes to wrap up, and then also to promote if you anything that you'd like to do, your organization. Hold on a second. You have something, Princeton? No. Okay. Please, this next 2 minutes are all yours.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a good, wide-ranging conversation. I have an article out in a publication called National Affairs. It's kind of a 6,000-word essay, sort of in between a long study and an op-ed. It's called Hobby Lobby and the Future of Freedom, and it goes into these issues about regulations and mandates and how they affect civil society. I also have a book on Hobby Lobby, more specifically about that case. You can Google that or look on Amazon. And, Cato's website, cato.org, has my writing. You can go out and see what I'm up to in all these different areas, or my colleagues, whatever area of public policy that you might be interested in.
Yeah. You also, if you subscribe and you send a donation, you get a monthly newsletter as well, or a little magazine from Cato Institute, right?
As well as Pocket Constitution,
right.
Which is a two. You buy the Constitution, you get the Declaration for free.
Right.
Actually, my wife and I, for our wedding, we personalized these with our names and the date, and gave those out as wedding favors. That's limited edition. You're not going to find that online.
Yeah. Well, Ilya, I want to thank you so much for you taking your time and being on our program. I really enjoy the conversation, and I do hope that you will accept our invitation to return at a later date. Maybe when we go four-way, which we're going to do in the next couple of months, we can have a little debate maybe with a couple of the scholars as well.
Sure. My pleasure. Take care, Larry.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye now. Folks, this is all right, let's play that music. All right, folks, this is the end of today's broadcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. As my wife would say, she has a saying, and she repeats it to me all the time, and she's very right. She said, it's if you want to change things, you have to do something. Keeping everything the same way is the easiest thing in the world. Don't do anything. If you're striving to protect your liberties, you have to strive. You have to do something. If you're not striving to do something, you're allowing to be taken away. Remember those words. Folks, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Until, I guess this will be, our next broadcast will be next Monday at 8 a.m. Central Time. Till then, stay well, stay tuned.